She slept in the warehouse to save money until a millionaire discovered her and changed everything. The flashlight sliced the dark like a clean cut. For a second the beam trembled across racks of boxed inventory, glinted off pallet wrap and the cold edge of a metal shelf. Then it found her, curled small and deliberate on a narrow stripe of space, uniform sleeves pulled tight against a thin chest, a scrap of cardboard folded as a pillow, a single photograph tucked beside her like a talisman. She woke with a start, breath visible in the warehouse chill, and froze when the light landed on her face. Marina Costa did not scream. She had learned in 6 months to keep fear contained. The reflex that rose first was not panic, but calculation. How to explain, what to say, how to protect the rhythm she had kept so carefully, work until midnight, vanish into the stacks, sleep where the forklifts left a margin, rise before dawn, to bathe in the men's restroom, fold uniform into the same neat square that passed for bedding, and collect pennies for a rent that kept slipping further away. The man holding the flashlight had descended from another world. He stood too upright for the crates, his jacket uncreased, shoes almost too clean. His eyes were slow to catalogue. When they finally settled on her, the hardness in them softened for a second, then tightened into questions he had not expected to ask himself. Who sleeps in their own workplace to keep a roof over someone's head? "Are you?" he began, then stopped. He was not a security guard. He would learn later what title he carried meant in boardrooms and local news cycles. CEO, founding partner, the man with the lines on his face that only money and responsibility make. For this first moment, he was simply a man with a flashlight who had walked past a life he did not know existed. Marina's fingers clutched the photograph, a small, sun-faded image of Juliana laughing with missing teeth. The girl's hair was pulled into a sloppy ponytail. A sticker clung to the corner of the photo, a reminder of a school day. Marina slid the picture into the lining of her jacket, as if concealing it would make it safer. She said. The word was raw. It could have been an apology, an explanation, a confession. The flashlight threw hard light across her face and threw the rest into shadow. She kept her voice small. I was saving for rent. The CEO, Ricardo Almeida, had prepared for factory reports and quarterly forecasts, not for pages from a life he had never looked at. He did not make a move to invite pity. Pity, he would learn, was never enough. Instead, he let silence do the work of presence. The warehouse hummed with the distant pulse of machinery, and somewhere, far off, someone cuffed a pallet in the night. How long? Ricardo asked, because asking is what people do when they need to measure a problem. Since March, Marina said. 6 months. He registered the time as if it were a ledger entry. 6 months of missed nights, of rationed coffee and cold meals. 6 months of scheduling life around a place that paid her, but would not shelter her. A detail flashed in his mind. Late-night entries on time cards, the rhythms of overtime. But there was no place for numbers now. There was only the sight of a woman with a worn uniform for a blanket, a child's photo at her side, and the weight of decisions he had the power to influence. They moved like cautious strangers. Marina tucked her knees closer to her chest, guarding a private space that had become an emblem of her insistence. She had chosen this shelf the way someone chooses a lifeline. The conveyor belt's quiet lullaby had become a substitute for a lullaby she could not afford to sing. She had told no one at work. There was pride in that silence, and a stubbornness she did not think to hide. Acceptance was not an option. Survival was. A forklift hummed in the distance, lights passing like sleepy planets. Ricardo stepped back, gathering himself with the quick, practical gestures of a man used to fixing things by signing papers and calling meetings. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marina," she replied. The name had the smell of damp cardboard and lemon soap from the public restroom where she washed. It carried a history of late bus rides, double shifts, and the math of a single mother who would not let shame decide her daughter's fate. He could have left then. He could have pretended not to have seen and justified it with policy or distance. Instead, he asked the questions that made the ordinary inconvenient for people in tidy offices. Where did she sleep before? Where was her child? Who knew? She answered in small pieces. Juliana, 6 years old, slept at her neighbor's some nights, at a friend's house other nights. Marina left a battered backpack of clothes with a woman who owed a favor. The truth stitched together a pattern that did not fit with the praise the company gave in glossy brochures about family values. After a while, Ricardo lowered the flashlight. The discovery had a gravity that made him slightly absurd in his own life, as if he had stumbled into a hidden corridor of the building that led to the company's conscience. He said nothing about being a millionaire, about yachts or investments, about the meetings that had filled his calendar. None of that mattered in the cold lanes of the warehouse. What mattered was that someone who worked the night shift had no place to sleep but where the goods waited. He offered Marina money. She refused. "No charity," she said, with the neat stubbornness of someone who had built her dignity out of the little choices she could control. "I don't want a donation. I just need time to find a place." Her refusal was not indignation, but a boundary. Marina had not slept on that shelf because she wanted to be invisible. She had done it because there was no acceptable alternative that kept Juliana's world whole. She had learned to answer pity with the clean, sharp language of agency. Ricardo, for all his wealth, was not immune to the force of a refusal. People ask for help in different ways. Sometimes they beg, sometimes they barter. Marina's way was steadier. He left, promising nothing official, making a promise that later would become the hinge of several lives. He would look into it. When the warehouse doors clicked shut behind him, Marina resumed the careful choreography of going invisible. She sat up and smoothed the sleeves of her uniform, because tucked into uniform was the map of her life. She had kept a small notebook with a list of goals and expenses, a ledger of hope. The pages had smudged ink where she had cried once. The handwriting toward the back grew steadier, as if writing itself into being had made the future less uncertain. Her mind drifted to Juliana, how the girl liked to line up her stuffed animals and arrange them by order of bravery, how she hummed the same 2 notes when counting her fingers. Marina imagined, with a maternal ache that was both tender and strategic, the moment Juliana would wake to a kitchen that smelled warm, a floor clear of boxes, a bed that was not a strip of cardboard. In the morning, she would clock out, face daylight like a soldier faces a new battleground, and collect her small payment. She would step into the bus that smelled of heat and rubber, and hold the photo of her daughter like a map. She would do this again and again, until the sum of small refrains aligned into a place they could call home. The first week after the flashlight, rumors moved through the night shift like small flares. Someone had seen a well-dressed man wandering near the storage aisles. Someone else had seen him talking to Marina. People whispered, fuel for the inevitable tribunal of gossip. But gossip can be a blunt instrument in a place where you clock in and out. It did not change the fact that Marina still had to report for work on Monday, still had to smile when the morning briefing called for team cohesion. Beatrice noticed the change first. Beatrice had worked alongside Marina for years, palms calloused from pallet straps, laughter that came quick and sank slow. She had watched Marina's careful savings, the little lunches packed in repurposed sandwich bags, the way she kept her hat folded with the thrift of someone who expected to mend it later. Beatrice did not judge. She only recognized the thinness of the line between getting by and collapse. "You okay?" Beatrice asked when their shift overlapped, and Marina's eyes looked heavier than the night's work would justify. "Okay," Marina said. She had practiced the word until it fit. "You sure?" Beatrice pressed, because working side by side makes strangers into confidants and confidants into witnesses. Beatrice had a way of seeing people not as problems to fix, but as humans to keep company with. She put a hand on Marina's shoulder in a brief professional way, and the touch carried a solidarity that needed no explanation. Donizelia, the veteran janitor, whose bony hands remembered the building's rhythms long before its contracts shifted, was another who would later step forward. She'd been sweeping near Dock 4 when she found a tiny sock, too small to belong to any of the night crew, in a corner. She had set it aside, not thinking of consequence, only of order. Little things gather meaning in the margins. Marina's life outside the warehouse read like a list of micro-deprivations: economy-sized shampoo that lasted a week, a phone that died at the worst hour, a bus route that extended her workday by an extra hour each way. She kept a small ritual with her coins. At the end of every week she emptied her change into a tin, the clink like a tiny reward for endurance. For months that tin had carried more promise than comfort. Juliana's world, seen through Marina's tired eyes, was a mosaic of borrowed moments. Some nights Juliana slept at her neighbor's, sometimes at a cousin's apartment where the TV played cartoons too loud. Marina timed her paydays like a clock, aligning them against school fees, the odd broken shoe, and a class trip that Juliana wanted with a child's certainty. The photograph beside her made those priorities tangible. In the picture, Juliana's grin was wide and unself-conscious. It was the promise Marina kept returning to. The company, on paper, was proud of its people-first language. Banners hung in the lobby, extolling development programs and competitive benefits. Yet the gaps between public statements and staff realities were the sort of thing that grew quietly, like moss in a shaded corner. Marina had been on the receiving end of policies that read protective, but functioned as obstacles: a denied promotion because of cultural fit, a raise reallocated to someone else with better connections. She had filed the required forms, made the polite complaints, and watched the files collect in a human resources drawer that smelled faintly of machine oil. Fernanda Siqueira, HR supervisor, kept a ledger of reputations. She believed in order and the shape of things. Where Marina saw necessity and moral compromise, Fernanda saw boundaries to be maintained. Rogerio Diaz, operations manager, was the kind of boss who valued neat lines over messy humanity, schedules, quotas, the efficient rhythmic beat of output. Their choices would later be read as a pattern, but in the beginning they were just managerial decisions. A missed promotion here, a questioned overtime claim there. To Marina, it felt like a slow attrition of opportunity. On a rain-damp Tuesday, Ricardo sat at his polished desk and could not stop thinking about the photograph. He had seen hundreds of charts, dozens of employee profiles, but none of them had convinced him to lean into a moral discomfort as quickly as the sight of a child's sun-faded smile. He could have relegated the warehouse incident to a security report and moved on. He did not. There was a practical way to begin: look at the files. He called his assistant, asked for staffing reports, timecard anomalies, HR correspondence. Those were bureaucratic acts, the kind that rarely feel like acts of tenderness. But he was not searching for sentiment. He was searching for answers. Digits and documents told a story that made his jaw set. Marina's performance evaluations were consistently above average. Notes, short, clipped, praised her reliability. Yet requests for a promotion went nowhere. Raises had been postponed under the rubric of budget constraints. More unsettling were the footnotes, complaints filed in her name that read thin when compared to the factual rhythm of her attendance and production. They suggested something else: deliberate friction, friction that makes competent people stumble. Ricardo's view narrowed. He began to pull names and dates, emails and scanned letters. A pattern emerged not of accident, but of convenience. a manager who promoted an inside candidate with close ties, an HR supervisor who logged trivial complaints that delayed progress, a chain of small decisions that stacked like bricks until they built a wall between deserving employees and advancement. He stayed late that night, working under the cold glow of his desk lamp, scrolling through a world he had not been trained to interrogate. He felt the odd looseness of someone who had trafficked in profit margins and now confronted moral margins. He thought of the photograph of the laughing child and of Marina's refusal to take charity. He felt a responsibility that felt heavier than the weight on a balance sheet. Back at the warehouse, Marina tucked her notebook into the lining of her jacket and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warehouse's breathing become a lullaby. She had learned a set of small habits that were both defiance and design. She double-checked the latch on the pallet, arranged the cardboard like a mattress, and rehearsed the story she would tell in case someone asked. An explanation that would not surrender her agency, but would keep her from being reduced to a cautionary tale. She thought of the day Juliana lost a tooth and put it under a cracked lampshade by mistake. Juliana had been so delighted by the ritual, the way small violences were softened by childhood wonder, that Marina had laughed until her chest ached. Those flashes of normal life were the fuel she kept in reserve. Word moved through the building like an undertow. At first it was quiet, a rumor here, a sympathetic look there. Then subtle shifts. Overtime relogged, a supervisor's call left unanswered, began to reveal themselves. People who had once shrugged at HR notices now checked their own files. The air of routine began to taste like something else. Exposure. Donna Celia asked questions in the quiet way of someone who has seen the building at its best and worst. "You see how they keep things tidy until someone trips," she said to Beatrice while they folded blue gloves into neat rows. "They sweep around the truth so no one trips over it." Beatrice snorted, not unkindly. Maybe now someone will sweep the right way. Marina did not want a spectacle. She did not want pity paraded across the lunchroom. Her decision to sleep in the warehouse had been tactical, not theatrical. But she also did not want to be invisible. There is a difference between being unseen by choice and being unseen by neglect. Her bones had grown tired of pretending the latter was a neutral condition. Ricardo's nights blurred into research. He found an email thread where Fernanda had recommended against Marina for a promotion, citing team dynamics and the need for a stable profile. The phrases were bureaucratic sugar for a practice that punished people who did not have the networks to advocate for themselves. He found comments from Rogerio about loyalty and fitting in that read like a code for favoritism. He traced a pattern of small sabotages, lost paperwork, late signatures, last-minute scheduling conflicts that made Marina's availability seem suspect. None of it was explosive on its own. Together, though, it formed the kind of quiet architecture that kept certain people from climbing. On a Wednesday, Ricardo asked to meet Marina properly. He wanted to hear the story she was willing to tell outside the geometry of boxes and forklifts. She agreed, wary but not surprised. The meeting took place in a modest conference room whose glass walls split the plant into a place of spectacle and a place of labor. Marina arrived with her notebook clutched to her chest, the photo of Juliana folded inside. She sat with both wrists on the table, as if to anchor herself against the pull of new attention. Ricardo asked questions with a care he had not been taught in business school. He asked about the timeline, about the little acts that built into a life-saving choice. He listened. He did not offer platitudes. He asked about the denials and the paperwork and the people who had stood in the way. Marina answered, steady-handed. There was anger in her tone, a low, focused indignation that had been simmering for months. But she was not angry for the sake of catharsis. Her anger was precision. It aimed at a pattern, so others might not fall through. "You refused money in the warehouse," Ricardo said quietly, remembering the flash of light and the cardboard pillow. Why? Because charity fixes the moment, Marina said. Someone sleeps in a bed that night, but nothing changes. I needed a steady place, not a one-night miracle. His gaze rested on her, startled by the clarity of her moral argument. Many in his position might have dismissed the reasoning as pride. He could not. Marina's refusal was a plea for structural change, not sentimental rescue. That meeting became a hinge. He left with a list of things to check. He did not announce that he would change the world. He simply began the work of documentation. He called for employee files and requested a breakdown of promotions and denials. He did not yet know what he would do with what he found, only that he could not unsee the shelf and the folded photograph it had sheltered. If the first stage of the story was the flash of a flashlight and the reveal of a life, the second was the slow, grinding bureaucracy that either corrects injustice or composes reasons to ignore it. Ricardo's choice to look was an invitation to the company to see its own shadows. Word of the CEO's interest leaked, how it always does, first as a hallway whisper and then as a departmental hum. People who had been marginalized raised their heads. Drafted grievances that had been living in drawers came out, softly at first, then with the force of collection. Beatrice turned up with a small envelope of notes, times she had covered shifts for Marina, nights she had carried extra work so Marina could catch a bus. Donna Celia carried her own small ledger of observation, the things only someone who swept years' worth of dirt sees. The way certain files were always late, the way certain names received quiet preference. Marina felt the attention as both relief and threat. Relief came in the form of recognition. Threat came as the possibility of becoming, in the eyes of colleagues, a symbol whose edges could be scraped for gossip. Her instinct to protect Juliana pushed at the corners of her life in new ways. School begins on Monday, she thought. Juliana needs routine. Marina had always believed that stability was not a nice-to-have. It was the architecture of childhood. For his part, Ricardo felt an unfamiliar disquiet. Seeing injustice from the vantage of a top floor had an exhilarating sting, a call to action he could not deflect into spreadsheets. He began to think not simply about correcting a wrong, but about preventing the system from manufacturing more of them. He wrote emails in the late hours, sometimes startling himself with the force of his own language. He requested an audit of internal hiring practices. He wanted names. He wanted to see where small favors had become structures. There were limits to what he could do alone. The company had policies, unions, contracts, and public image to consider. When you move within systems that bind many hands, every action becomes a negotiation. But the flashlight had already done its work. A life had been made visible. Marina's life pivoted on the spine of a single choice: to keep working. She had refused charity not out of stubborn pride, but from a conviction that autonomy meant being able to provide for Juliana without being reduced to spectacle. Now, with the CEO poking at the seams, that autonomy might shift into something else. She was acutely aware of the precariousness of being seen. To be visible in the wrong way could mean judgment rather than justice. On a Thursday, in the narrow kitchen of a neighbor's apartment where Juliana sometimes stayed, Marina sat with a battered envelope in her lap. Her hands folded the bills she had not spent on a new pair of shoes. The coins in her tin seemed heavier now, like small weights of possibility. She allowed herself a minute to imagine stability. A room with white walls. A bed that was not cardboard, a place where bedtime stories were not whispered in lockers. She did not presume, though. The path from being discovered to being given a home is complex. People have the power to change things, but systems bend slowly. Marina understood that. Her notebook, folded in the pocket of her jacket, contained more than a list of needs. It contained a plan for how to rebuild, prioritize rent, secure daycare options, find a school route that did not require 2 buses, save for small emergencies. Her goals were pragmatic and precise because she knew hope must be arrangeable, it must be stapled to reality. At the same time, the small centers of solidarity in the warehouse were gathering. Beatrice brought a jar of leftover soup to Marina one night, as if a shared meal signaled more than sustenance. "You can sleep here for now," Beatrice said, in the exact tone of someone making an offer that accepted limits. "But let's see what happens." Donna Celia spoke to a friend in a community center who passed the story along to someone who knew someone. An ecosystem of favors and favors returned. The building hummed with the slow work of people aligning themselves to do the humane thing. It was ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Ricardo held the audit results the following week and felt his stomach clench. The data were not dramatic in isolation. No single email screamed corruption. Instead, the pattern read loud in its accumulation. Promotions skewed toward people with pre-existing relationships. Over time, approvals were inconsistent in a way that advantaged insiders. Complaints filed by Marina were reassigned as pending and then postponed indefinitely. His eyes found Fernanda's name in the list more than once. Rogerio's approvals had an odd cadence. He called a meeting with HR under the guise of routine oversight. It was not routine. He kept his voice measured, professional. Fernanda arrived in a blouse that matched the office's conservative payroll. She had the steady gait of someone used to authority. Rogerio arrived terse, his hands thick with the day's measurements. Ricardo laid out what he had found without flourish. Men like him often stage moments like this as management theater, gestures meant to reassure the public and placate the staff. But Ricardo had the taste for accountability now, and that changed the feel of the room. Fernanda answered with practiced calm. "There are many factors that govern promotions," she said. "We need stability in leadership. We also have documented missed promotions and denied raises that conflict with performance records," Ricardo replied. He did not raise his voice. He let the paperwork do the work of accusation. "We have employees who have been sidelined. We have a staff member sleeping in the warehouse. That cannot be a coincidence." Fernanda bristled, the way someone does when caught between a defensive procedure and the exposure of its consequences. Rogerio shifted his weight, uncomfortable under the light of causality. This was the beginning of a moral accounting. It was also practical management. Decisions would have to be made, and those decisions would ripple. Before anything could harden into policy, before firings or demotions or glad tidings, something else happened. The human element fractured into public voices. The fired HR supervisor, if fired was what would ultimately happen, was not yet part of the narrative. For now, the company sat on a precipice, with one side marked remedy and the other side already forming as retaliation. Marina, for her part, kept doing the work she had always done, packing boxes, reading her notebook, folding washing under the dim lights of the restroom. She was careful about small joys. Juliana's drawing stuck to the inside of a locker, a bar of soap saved for a weekend bath. Life's measures were intimate and stubborn. The day Ricardo walked past the shelf again, he paused. The photograph was not there. Someone had moved it. Perhaps Marina had taken it with her to the meeting. Perhaps a co-worker had rescued it from the damp. The emptiness where the picture had been felt like a silence waiting to be filled. He felt, then and without fanfare, like a man newly awake to the consequences of his attention. He had the power to change certain things. But power without listening is a crude instrument. He needed to listen and, more importantly, to act in ways that would not convert Marina's dignity into spectacle. That night, after the meeting with HR had closed, with the polite neutrality that meetings use to cushion the sharpness of choice, Ricardo walked home through rain and fluorescent streetlight, thinking of the photograph and the shelf and the woman who had refused his money. He found himself wondering not about headlines, but about the small architecture of daily life. how bus routes, daycare availability, and the tilt of managerial favor combined to make some people invisible. He knew he would have to decide how far he would go. He had the legal team, he had reputations to manage, he had a board that liked predictability. He also had the sight of a child's photo and a woman who would not accept charity. Those things have a way of rearranging priorities. Meanwhile, in a classroom across town, Juliana finger-painted with the focus only children have. She hummed absent-mindedly, clutching a crayon like it were a compass. A child's world is elastic. It stretches around absence like light around an object. Juliana's teacher noticed that she seemed distracted and asked gently where her mother slept. Children talk in oblique truths. Juliana answered with a shrug, bright and matter-of-fact. She sometimes sleeps where the boxes are, she said, as if naming a fact as simple as the sky. The teacher's eyes softened. In the weeks to come, small things would tighten, the playground whispers, the classroom questions. But for now, it was a child's remark, a pebble thrown into a pond whose ripple would only later reach a shore. Back at the plant, whispers began to coalesce into a demand for clarity. Ricardo pulled together a small, careful team, including an outside counsel, to ensure the documentation was clean. He requested interviews. He sat at tables and listened to stories he had not been present for before. The pattern of marginalization unfolded like a map. Each story, each small injustice, was a cartography of the same terrain: misplaced paperwork, postponed raises, an internal culture that valued connections over competence. Marina's story, paired and straightforward, held an inner logic that made other stories easier to name. She had not come to them looking for pity. She had come asking questions in her own life. Questions about the fairness of promotions, about the possibility of being both a worker and a parent without being punished by time. That clarity gave others permission to name their own experiences. When the night in the warehouse first became visible, it was an intimate thing, a private solution to a public problem. Once visible, the private becomes inevitably political. What people decide to do with visibility, use it to shame, to fix, to exploit, has consequences that spread beyond the person first seen. Ricardo realized this with a mix of fear and resolve. He had stepped into a problem that demanded more than a single check. It demanded policy. But the story was not ready to be neat. There were people who would not accept being held accountable without resistance. There would be retaliation from those whose authority grated against exposure, and there would be moments when Marina's family life would be most vulnerable to public scrutiny. Visibility is a two-edged thing. It can protect and it can shred. That edge would be the place where the next series of choices would play out. How the company chose to remedy the harm, how the staff rallied, and how Marina would navigate the transformation of being both the subject of concern and the author of her future. For now, the flashlight's beam had widened into an audit, and the ledger of favors and denials lay on Ricardo's desk like a provocation. In the quiet of her neighbor's kitchen that night, Marina counted her coins. Each clink was a small testimony to endurance. She put the coins back in their tin and sank into the thin cushion of the chair. There was a kind of fatigue that was not physical so much as existential. Tiredness at being continually required to prove one's worth. She thought about Juliana's face in the photograph, the way the child's smile folded open like a small, extraordinary thing in the center of ordinary days. She did not want to be someone else's story. She wanted to be the author of her own life. If the company's interest now put her in the light, she intended to use that light to build something steady, not to be paraded as an example of charity. Her voice, careful and upright, had already made that clear. Outside, the city hummed. Somewhere a bus hissed, a late-night diner closed, a street lamp buzzed. Inside the plant, shift changes moved like the unseen gears of a machine. The photograph of Juliana returned to Marina's pocket, warmed under the jacket like a small secret. On Ricardo's desk, the files lay open. The pattern they showed was a quiet indictment, one made of small acts rather than grand malice. He understood that public remedy required care. He also understood that delaying action had moral cost. He picked up his phone. He could call an HR meeting. He could call a press briefing. He could do nothing. For the first time in a long while, the choices felt less procedural and more immediate. Human decisions in the face of human need. He dialed a number and asked for an expedited review. The thing he had found was not going to be swept into a quarterly report. It had a name, Marina, and a consequence that reached into a little girl's imagination. Outside the glass of the conference room, the warehouse lights blinked steady as stars. Inside, people's lives were about to be rearranged by choices that had weight. Somewhere between the shelf and the CEO's desk, an argument was beginning. Between the economy of business as usual and the economy of human dignity. If you feel this kind of story matters, subscribe. There are more stories about the people who keep going. Ricardo leaned back and stared at the ceiling, thinking about consequence. He would need more than good intentions. He would need signatures, policies, and a willingness to stand against the inertia that protects the powerful. He would also need witnesses, and he was about to find that some witnesses were louder than any boardroom. Across the facility, a small group of workers gathered after a shift, voices low and quick. Beatrice spoke first, practical as ever. "She kept her head down," she said, "but she wasn't invisible. We were just pretending." Donna Celia nodded, folding a broom's handle into the rhythm she had always held. "People see if they choose to," she said. "We saw." Marina stood in the doorway of the break room, hands tucked into her jacket, feeling the pull of an absence and a possible future. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dust, place and perseverance. She could have retreated to being small. She chose instead to speak in the way someone does when they have to fashion clarity from chaos. "I don't want to be thanked," she said. "I want things to change so no one else does what I had to do." Her words landed like a small bell. They were not dramatic. They were precise. That night, a file on Ricardo's desk bore the name of a policy draft. A review of promotion processes, signed comments about transparent oversight, a list of people to interview. The path to change was a ledger of small, heavy acts to correct records, to follow up on denied raises, to challenge the soft power that keeps certain people from moving forward. What was not yet clear was how the people whose authority was threatened would react. Inequity has defenders. Those who profit from arrangements seldom give them up without a fight. The first skirmish of that friction was quiet. An email to PR, a call to a friendly journalist, a whispered counter-narrative. Before the public swell, though, there was the private moment. A daughter tucking a folded drawing into a pocket, a mother writing urgent on a note as if the word could anchor a new reality. There was also somewhere a manager deciding whether to stand by procedures or to stand by people. Between the thin mattress of cardboard and the polished wood of a CEO's desk, lives were about to intersect in a way that would force decisions at every level. The discovery had been the spark. Now came the slow, dangerous thing, what people chose to do next. The discovery had been the spark. Now came the slow, dangerous thing, what people chose to do next. Fernanda moved like someone trained to manage impressions. She had spent years shaping personnel files, moderating narratives, folding messy human problems into polite language. Having her authority questioned felt like a personal attack. And there are people who react to threatened power by swinging the spotlight back at the person who exposed them. She made a call, She promised herself would only be professional, to an old contact at a local paper, someone who liked stories that smelled of scandal. Words were chosen to suggest impropriety rather than injustice. The angle they fed, quiet, insinuating, easy to sell, hinted that Marina had been rewarded beyond merit because she had staged her plight to gather attention. The story carried a photograph of the CEO leaving the plant. It used the language of opportunism and left out the parts that complicated the narrative. The piece ran the morning after a press breakfast, a narrow headline that spread quickly across gossip feeds and talk radios. People who skimmed the clip lines saw a tidy narrative: privileged boss, crafty worker. What was erased in that headline was the cardboard pillow, the folded photograph, the ledger of denied raises and postponed promotions. What was gilded was a version of Marina as a figure who had used visibility to her advantage. The company's PR team scrambled. Inside, Ricardo read the first iterations of the story and felt the familiar sting of being misread. He had known that holding a flashlight into a corner could create shadows elsewhere. He had also known that those who had the most to lose from exposure sometimes strike first. For Marina, the blow was immediate and intimate. Within hours, a teacher at Juliana's school read the story aloud in a hushed staff room, more surprised than cruel. By midday, small voices in the playground had learned a version that made Juliana's life complicated. Children repeat halves of facts into whole judgments. Juliana worried aloud that other kids would call her mother names. She pushed her cereal around and said little. Marina kept working, kept her face in its practiced neutrality, but the inside of her chest felt thinner than usual. "What did you do?" a classmate's mother hissed in the schoolyard, as if judging could contain the problem. Juliana retreated into a smaller, quieter form of herself. She clung to the photo in Marina's wallet that night, and when Marina tucked her into a borrowed bed, she asked a question she had not been asked before: "Did they say I'm ashamed?" The child's voice was small and precise. It was the kind of question that lands like a stone and measures a mother's answer. Marina's answer was not a defense, but a rehearsal of truth. "People say things when they don't know everything," she told Juliana. "We know who we are. That's what matters." Inside the plant, gossip curdled into something uglier. Fernanda called out procedural irregularities and suggested that the CEO's intervention had unbalanced the workplace. Rogerio took a defensive posture and began to argue that any sudden changes would wreak havoc with productivity. Voices that had been silent suddenly found a reason to press their privilege. For a moment it felt as if the work would unravel into blame and counter-blame, with Marina and her child at the center. But the building also contained another kind of voice, the one that belongs to people who have seen the slow accrual of injustice and will not let a single headline erase what they know. Beatriz recorded a short video on her phone, unpolished and direct. She spoke about covering shifts, about the nights she had held the line so Marina could make the bus, about late lunches shared and the stack of pay stubs that proved a story of steady, honest labor. Dona Celia posted a clip too, not looking at the camera, but cleaning the broom as she spoke, describing the tiny sock she had found and how she had watched a mother protect a child's future by any means necessary. Those videos landed like counterweights. They were raw, unmediated, and they insisted on details the press piece had omitted. Denied raises, missing paperwork, favoritism that could be traced in signatures. A client, Paulo Mendes, who had been in the office for a contract negotiation a month earlier, recorded a calm, compelling defense. He knew the company's operations and the people who kept them moving. He had seen Marina in action. Paulo's voice carried the authority of someone who bought a lot of product and therefore understood what competence looked like on the floor. "I've worked with these teams," he said. "Marina is not opportunistic. She is reliable. What I see now is a failure to recognize talent. Social media, which had first funneled the smear, became the same instrument of correction. The videos were shared, commented on, and stitched into short compilations that contrasted the glossy scandal with the texture of daily life. Viewers saw a woman who counted coins in a tin, a daughter who drew sunflowers, a co-worker who had the calluses of someone who loaded pallets at dawn. The tide of public opinion began to turn. Ricardo watched the shift happen in real time. Headlines popped up, then retreated. The smear's edges were trimmed by testimony. He felt the odd double pressure of being both accused of complicity and expected to act decisively. He had always underestimated how quickly a company's narrative could be redirected when a few voices spoke with truth. He realized that his initial acts, advancing a paycheck, initiating an audit, had not been enough to settle the wound. There would have to be more than gestures. Within the HR department, the pressure to produce a plausible deniability narrative increased. Fernanda, who had initiated the leak, tried to control the damage by framing her actions as an attempt to protect the company's reputation. It did not hold. The board demanded documentation. Emails were subpoenaed internally. The audit's findings were no longer just numbers, but moral markers that suggested a course of action. In the end, the board moved. Fernanda was dismissed for moral harassment and for violating the trust of employees. Rogerio was demoted for patterns of nepotism and preferential treatment. The moves were not theatrical. They were administrative, with lines on a page and signatures that carried consequences. For Marina, the actions meant nothing if they turned into spectacle. For others, they meant that the small, corrosive practices that had kept people from advancing would be challenged. But accountability, in an organization and in a community, has complicating edges. Fernanda, angry and humiliated, used the small network of contacts she still had in the press to push a second narrative. This time the piece arrived with insinuations about confidentiality breaches, the use of inside information, and a suggestion that Marina's exposure was part of a larger pattern of manipulating sympathy for personal gain. The story was framed as a controversy about privacy, about the dangers of publicizing internal matters. Some readers, fed on neat binaries, found the second piece persuasive enough to sustain doubt. Ricardo and the legal team responded in a manner that was both strategic and, to him, necessary. The company pursued legal action for breach of confidentiality against those who leaked protected internal files, and they pressed for corrections to the record. The move was aimed at protecting employees' private information and at reinforcing the idea that exposing wrongdoing did not justify criminalizing those harmed by it. It was a delicate balance. Public relations required tone, and legal action required rigor. As those processes unfolded, Marina found herself under an intense and uncomfortable spotlight. Reporters knocked at neighbors' doors. A camera appeared on the street outside Juliana's school. The child's cheeks flushed at whispered taunts. Marina began to feel that visibility, which had afforded her a path to change, also brought new vulnerabilities to her daughter. In the quiet hours after a shift, she sat in the small, borrowed kitchen and imagined ways to shield Juliana without retreating from the chance to push for structural fix. She made a decision. If the company was to correct its failures, it would not do so without the input of those who had lived them. Ricardo had offered an apartment and a promotion. She accepted the apartment, but insisted the promotion carry actual institutional power and not symbolic elevation. She refused to be paraded as a human interest item and demanded a role that would let her shape policy. When Ricardo proposed that she become part of a nascent initiative to address housing insecurity and promotion pipelines for frontline staff, Marina responded with a practical set of terms. She wanted transparency in selection criteria for aid, a committee with worker representatives, and direct oversight over the list of beneficiaries. She outlined daycare priorities and the need for a rapid response fund, practical items gleaned from sleepless nights and ledgered budgets. He listened, and this time his signature was meant to be a partnership rather than a parent's granting. Project Dignity, as Ricardo's team named the initiative in a press release, was conceived as both remediation and prevention. Subsidized housing solutions for staff in need, an internal pathway for promotions with blind review steps, transportation subsidies that shortened long commutes, and the establishment of on-site creche services so parents would not have to choose between attendance and income. The launch language was intentionally careful: measured figures, pilot programs, community partnerships. But behind the official wording were the people who had been pushing for change all along: Donna Celia, Beatriz, and a small group of employees who formed an advisory board with Marina at its center. Marina negotiated the conditions of her leadership. She refused to allow the initiative to be a PR bandage. "If we're helping people, help everyone who qualifies," she said in a meeting that felt less like a boardroom and more like a planning table. "Don't cherry-pick. Make the criteria public. Let the workers know how this works, so someone else won't have to sleep on a shelf." Her insistence on procedural clarity unsettled some executives who had been more comfortable with discretionary benevolence, the kind of help that can be quietly administered and quietly withheld. But it also won the trust of workers who had tired of favors and wanted systems. Her role, once accepted, made Project Dignity different from other corporate pilots. It was not charity, it was policy. The initial rollout was messy in the way all real-world change is. Filling apartment units, setting up trust funds, and contracting with daycare providers required negotiation and, at times, friction. There were long nights of paperwork and moments when Maria, no longer sleeping on cardboard but sleeping with the weight of responsibility, wondered if the trade-off had been worth it. She fielded calls from employees in tears, from families who needed immediate support, from colleagues who feared being overlooked in the first wave. She learned to prioritize urgency and fairness, and to say no when the need exceeded the program's immediate capacity. Saying no was part of her job now. It preserved the program's integrity. So many more could be helped later. In the weeks after the launch, the narrative outside the plant shifted again. The paper that had run the smear printed a retraction after the company's legal motion, and amid a growing chorus of first-hand testimony. The retraction did not erase the earlier damage, the taunting that Juliana endured, or the nights Marina lay awake worrying about being enough for her daughter, but it did reset public impression. Paulo Mendes's public endorsement of Marina and his statement about the company's need to honor workers' dignity carried weight in business circles. Other clients reached out privately to discuss the steps toward remediation. Within the plant, small, tangible repairs began. Denied promotions were reopened for review, pay discrepancies were adjusted, and back pay issued where records supported it. Employees were offered options to participate in Project Dignity's advisory board and help to fill out forms without fear of retribution. The internal culture did not transform overnight, but the machinery of favoritism was interrupted in ways that made the paths upward clearer. There were moments of real human reckoning. At a town hall meeting Ricardo convened, he spoke plainly about his own blind spots. He did not present himself as omniscient. Instead, he admitted that the company's language about family values had been performative and that policies had not matched rhetoric. He apologized for having overlooked processes that allowed favoritism to thrive. His apology was neither theatrical nor self-flagellating. It was an admission that his proximity to power had sometimes blinded him to the consequences of inattention. Marina listened from the front row. She had written a small list of priorities: affordable units to be allocated on a needs basis, transparent promotion panels with anonymous review steps, creche schedules aligned with night shifts, and a rapid response childcare fund. She presented each point with the clarity she had always used in planning for life: pragmatic, enforceable, and compassionate. Her voice did not carry the ring of someone seeking vindication. It carried the authority of someone who had lived the problem and now had a mandate to fix it. Her leadership style in those early months revealed the truth of what dignity looks like at work. Practical systems, not symbolic gestures. She refused to let the initiative be captured by optics. If a building was to be filled with staff, she wanted the selection to be fair. If daycare slots were to be created, she wanted hours that matched unpredictable shifts. She insisted on published minutes for the advisory committee and quarterly reports on outcomes. She made people sign up for responsibilities and meet deadlines because making promises to families required a level of discipline that matched the urgency of need. Resistance remained. Some managers grumbled that the new oversight slowed processes. Others privately convened to complain about social media influencing corporate decisions. But the program had something those critics could not easily argue with: real people whose lives improved. A night shift worker who had once ridden 2 buses now cut his commute in half with a company shuttle. A mother returned to work knowing her toddler was in a creche whose hours matched her shift. A worker who had been passed over for promotion saw his application re-evaluated through a blind review and was promoted on merit. These small successes aggregated into a narrative shift that many had once thought impossible, dignity becoming organizational practice rather than a campaign slogan. Marina, in her role, was careful to shepherd the program with a blend of fierce practicality and steady compassion. She met with families, visited apartments, and signed off on payroll adjustments. She also sat on strategic calls with the executive team, insisting that financial accountability should not be used as an excuse to delay human needs. The smear had left marks that did not vanish quickly. Juliana still flinched at the flash of a camera. Children are resilient, but they are also susceptible to the impressions adults leave. Marina reheated kindness in small doses. She arranged a pizza for her daughter's class, volunteered at a school reading hour, and, when time allowed, tucked Juliana into a small, properly made bed each night. Those mundane rituals mattered as much as any press release. As Project Dignity moved from pilot to program, the board asked for measurable results. Marina's team produced quarterly reports that listed hardened outcomes without theatrical numbers: how many families had been rehoused, how many staff had participated in blind recruitment panels, and how many creche slots were active. The reports used careful language, as recorded in internal files, and tied improvements to specific policy changes. They were not perfect. They showed a program still learning. But they also showed a company that, when confronted with its shortcomings, chose to fix them in ways that could be replicated. There were also stories of reconciliation. Rogerio, demoted and admonished, was not simply cast out. He was required to attend training on bias and fair processes and to participate in a review panel that evaluated his past decisions. It was a hard path for someone who had once seen management as a hierarchy of privilege, but the emphasis on rehabilitation rather than simple dismissal fit the program's ethos. Accountability and correction, not merely retribution. Fernanda, after being dismissed, found herself at the center of a legal dispute over confidentiality. The press retraction and the company's suit complicated her attempt to shape a final narrative. In the end, her professional path diverged. Some doors closed, others in different sectors opened. The story did not need to render her a villain. It needed to hold her accountable. Holding people responsible without turning them into caricatures was part of the moral work the company now attempted. Months passed in a rhythm of small victories and hard learning. Marina found herself pulled in multiple directions: meetings at dawn, home by late evening, the constant negotiation of parenting and leadership. The old ledger she had kept in her jacket, pages of goals and expenses was replaced by new lists, meeting minutes, program budgets, housing contracts. She still kept a small tin at home with coins she had not yet folded into savings. It reminded her that change had cost effort, and that even administrators needed to remember where they came from. The social landscape around their community shifted too. Local non-profits partnered with Project Dignity to offer furniture for apartments and educational workshops for parents. A small grant from a philanthropic foundation allowed the program to fund emergency moves for families on short notice. The company donated a vacant parcel for a small community garden near the new housing development. It was emblematic work, practical and symbolic at once. Soil turned over to feed people who now had room for a kitchen table. As the calendar arrowed forward, more tangible proof of transformation accumulated. Workers who had once been quiet about their dreams found a space to speak them aloud. Training programs filled up with people who wanted to grow their skills. The creche's morning chorus, once an unfamiliar sound in the plant's daily life, became a constant reminder of why the work mattered. Families, not numbers. One autumn evening, almost a year from the night of the flashlight, the company organized a public meeting to present the program's first-year outcomes. The small hall, less polished than the boardroom but more human, filled with staff, neighbors, and a few members of the press. Banners announced Project Dignity with a modest logo. There were folding chairs and boxed refreshments. Juliana tugged at Marina's sleeve and found a front-row seat next to Beatrice and Donna Celia. Ricardo spoke first, with an economy of words that had been shaped by months of listening. He did not take credit so much as admit complicity. The company had failed to see the lives that made it function. He spoke of audit findings and displaced opportunity, of policies that had allowed favoritism to calcify into practice. It was not a speech of salvation. It was a speech of ownership. Then Marina rose. Where Ricardo's words framed institutional error, Marina's framed possibility. She did not tell a story of being saved. She told the story of how people can choose to see one another and translate sight into action. She spoke of a mother who kept a notebook of goals, of a daughter who lined up stuffed animals by bravery, of co-workers who dropped a jar of soup on a night when someone needed it. The language was plain, the images were domestic and therefore universal. "Dignity is not a gift," she said. "Dignity is a right that we have to organize around. We don't give it away like charity. We build it into the ways we work." She outlined the program's first-year achievements and with calm detail explained the mechanisms: blind review boards, a housing allocation committee with worker representatives, creche hours aligned to shift needs, and a rapid response fund for emergency relocations. She also acknowledged what they had learned: the program's wait lists, the need for better communication, the ongoing challenge of dismantling old habits. Her last lines landed quietly but firmly. "We are not done," she said. "We are only beginning to make this place live up to its promises. If we keep doing the work, fewer children will worry about where their parents sleep. If we keep doing the work, the dignity of labor will be matched by the dignity of life." Juliana watched her mother with a serious face, and then, at the end, clapped with the innocent zeal of a child who believes in big things. The hall erupted in applause that was warm and genuine. It was not the clap of a press gala. It was the clap of neighbors who had watched sweat turn into policy. After the meeting, people lined up to speak with Marina. Some brought gratitude, some brought complicated questions. Beatrice hugged her until both women laughed through tears. Donna Celia insisted on offering a broom as a symbolic gift, an old habit of presenting tools to people starting new work. Ricardo stood to the side, hands in his pockets. His face carried the look of someone who had been reshaped by what he had seen. A small group of staff, who had been promoted through the program, Candidates who had been evaluated blind and then recognized for competence presented short testimonials. One man spoke about finishing a certification course because Project Dignity offered the time and subsidies to do so. A woman described the relief of having childcare aligned with her night shift and the dignity of bringing home consistent pay. These stories were not triumphalist. They were practical confirmations that policy could change a life. Later, when the room had emptied and the banners were being folded, Ricardo approached Marina. He did not offer grand gestures. He offered partnership. "You did this," he said simply, and meant it. "We did it together." The phrase held less ego and more joint responsibility than any press release could. Marina accepted the words, but did not allow them to be a full stop. There was more work to do. The months that followed were shaped by the improvisational labor of systems. New staff orientation included sessions on fair promotion practices. The HR team was restructured with oversight panels that included worker representatives. A volunteer group from the plant started an after-school program in the community center for children like Juliana, and companies from the local industrial district donated time and resources. Marina kept an office not because power had perched on her, but because people needed an accessible place to bring problems. Her desk was cluttered with applications, names, receipts, and a small framed photograph of Juliana at a birthday party. She scheduled walk-in hours in the evenings to speak with night shift workers and to catch those who could not attend daytime meetings. Her presence sent a subtle message. Leadership does not always happen behind closed doors. Often it happens in break rooms and in the corners where people gather after shifts. There were setbacks. The program's budget had limits, and sometimes hard choices had to be made about who received immediate assistance. People who had waited years grumbled about prioritization. But Marina was deliberate. Criteria were published, waiting lists managed, and appeals allowed. She insisted on fairness, even when it required saying no. One story from that period stuck in the plant's collective memory. A young woman, newly hired and 7 months pregnant, found herself trapped between eviction notices and the need to save for a future she could not yet predict. Project Dignity's Rapid Response Fund moved quickly. An emergency deposit, a referral to a stable apartment, and immediate enrollment in the creche program after the child was born. The young woman returned to work on time and later enrolled in a training program that gave her a promotion. She became a vocal advocate for the program and a volunteer in the after-school program. These small arcs, individual trajectories of stability restored, were the program's quiet proofs. They were also reminders that structural change is always a patchwork of case-by-case solutions woven into policy. In private moments, Marina sometimes caught herself feeling the old, uneasy gratitude, that sense that change had been bestowed upon her by benevolent hands. She worked to erase that feeling with practice. She insisted on being present at meetings where criteria were set. She refused honorifics without responsibility. She wanted the program to have the teeth of procedure and the warmth of empathy. She also wanted to ensure the narrative remained anchored in dignity, not spectacle. At home, the simple things shifted in ways that felt miraculous in their ordinariness. Juliana went to school without worry about where her mother slept. They painted the smallest bedroom in the new apartment a pale blue. Juliana started piano lessons, the kind Marina had once budgeted and postponed for the next always. Sundays became a fixed rhythm of pancakes, not because they had much more money, but because the anxiety that had crowded their lives had a thinner presence now. One evening, while Juliana practiced a clumsy scale, Marina sat at the kitchen table and added up receipts for the week. She smiled at the smallness of the math. Bus fares, groceries, a returned ear of corn from a neighbor's garden. Counting expenses felt less like survival planning and more like the normal work of building a life. The photograph of Juliana with a missing tooth hung on the fridge with a magnet, now a domestic ornament instead of a talisman. The 1-year mark arrived with a modest celebration. Project Dignity released its first-year report, not as a trophy but as a candid accounting. The report acknowledged faults, listed improvements, and laid out plans for the future. It spoke of rehoused families, of creche attendees, of staff promoted through blind review processes, and of training completions. It named things as reported and documented, mindful of the line between measurable outcome and human complexity. At the anniversary event, Marina stood again to speak. This time she had learned to let the narrative breathe. She told a story not about herself, but about the people who had made the work possible. The janitor who had noticed a small sock, the co-worker who had shared a jar of soup, the client who had offered a public endorsement when it mattered. She thanked people by name. She refused to place herself at the center. "I don't want to be anyone's poster child," she told the gathering. "I want this program to be the place where ordinary acts of decency become policy. If we keep doing the hard work, if we publish the rules, if we listen, if we measure results, then fewer children will be tempted to believe that invisibility is the only option." When she finished, Beatrice hugged her. Ricardo made a small, private gesture. He handed her an envelope with an agreed salary advance to support long-term housing stability, an administrative act that meant less than the creation of a system but mattered in its immediacy. After the event, people clustered in groups, sharing small jokes and plans. Juliana ran through the crowd like any confident child, her teeth flashing in a grin that had not been possible during the months of hiding. She climbed into Marina's lap and asked what would happen next. Marina answered with the kind of plain hope that had become her practice. More oversight, more vigilance, more moments where policy and human need intersected. In the quieter hours that night, Marina set a plate of cold pizza on the table and looked around the apartment. The bed was soft, the window smelled faintly of rain. A small plant Beatrice had gifted sat on the sill. She thought about the shelf where she had once slept and felt no sharp sting. The past remained a ledger she consulted sometimes to remind herself how the work had to be done. She also thought about the people who had hurt, Fernanda, Rogerio, and how accountability needed to leave room for repair when possible. She believed in consequences, but she also believed systems that only punished never truly healed. Her work now was to ensure the program sustained those on the margins and held leaders accountable. In the months after the anniversary, Project Dignity expanded cautiously. It took on partnerships with housing authorities and non-profit groups. The company's board accepted a recommendation to create a permanent oversight board with worker representation. The language of corporate responsibility shifted, not from sermonizing, but from a disciplined set of interventions. People would tell different versions of what had happened that night in the warehouse. Some would remember the flashlight and the dramatic moment of discovery. Others would remember the videos that flipped public opinion, or the press retraction, or the legal filing. But the core, what Marina always returned to, was simpler and more human. A mother had kept a child's world whole at great personal cost, and others had chosen not to look away. 1 year after the flashlight first cut the dark, Marina stood before a modest crowd at a community center and read letters from families who had been helped. She read them aloud, slowly, honoring the voices that had usually been only half heard. She spoke about the difficult work of turning empathy into policy and about how dignity required both immediate aid and sustained structures. When she finished, Juliana ran to the front to hand her mother a crayon drawing, flowers and a small sun. Marina held the picture for a long moment and then pinned it to the wall near the program's bulletin board. It was not just a mother's memento. It was a symbol of the reason for the work. As people filed out, Ricardo approached quietly. He had been less visible of late, opting to let the program's managers speak. He offered a small, uncomplicated compliment. "You made us better," he said. "It wasn't me," Marina replied. "It was everyone who chose not to look away." They both knew that would not close the chapter on injustice. New problems would appear, and old ones would stubbornly persist. But they also knew that an institutional pivot had been made, practices changed, oversight was installed, and people who had previously been unseen had a place at the table. That night, as Juliana fell asleep to the same 2 notes she hummed when counting her fingers, Marina sat at the kitchen table and opened a small, new notebook. She wrote a list, not of debts this time, but of next steps. A plan for expanding shuttle routes, a review of hiring panels, more community partnerships. She wrote with the same steady hand she once used to keep track of coins. The handwriting was steadier now, less a ledger of survival and more a map of civic responsibility. Outside, the plant's lights blinked like distant stars. Inside, a mother closed the door on a day that had been heavy and full. The photograph of Juliana with the missing tooth hung by the sink, a tiny, permanent witness to a life that had navigated shame and come through to steadier ground. When Marina blew out the small lamp on the bedside table and reached for Juliana's hand, she did not think of being rescued. She thought of the daily choices, the small acts of seeing, the insistence on fairness, that had built a program and had begun to repair a community. Dignity, she knew, was not something you found once. It was something you fought for every day, in policy and in practice. Later, when asked in an interview what changed everything that night, she answered simply, "People chose to see." Then she added with a quiet firmness, "And when they saw, they finally did what they should have been doing all along." If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in practical solutions to real problems. Let them know that dignity can be built, and that sometimes the smallest acts of attention start the largest changes.